In 1832, a young naturalist sailing aboard HMS Beagle recorded something in his journal that he openly admitted he could not fully explain. The sea around the ship, he wrote, was glowing, and the wake trailing behind the vessel burned with a strange pale light, bright enough to illuminate the water for a considerable distance. That naturalist was Charles Darwin, decades away from publishing the theory that would define his career, and even he had no real answer for what he was looking at. Darwin's account was far from an isolated curiosity either. Sailors across multiple centuries and multiple oceans recorded similar glowing seas long before anyone had the microscopic tools necessary to identify Noctiluca scintillans as the organism responsible, describing the phenomenon in terms ranging from wonder to genuine unease, an ocean that seemed to catch fire without any visible flame. Almost 2 centuries later, Australian beaches are still doing exactly the same thing. And the honest answer is that scientists understand less about why it keeps happening than you might expect. The basic mechanism has a name. Noctiluca scintillans, commonly called sea sparkle, a microscopic organism that produces a vivid blue light through a chemical reaction when physically disturbed by a breaking wave, a footstep in wet sand, or a hand moved through the water. During daylight hours, the same organism is barely worth a second glance, often appearing as nothing more than a faint reddish tinge across the surface of the water, frequently mistaken for an ordinary algae bloom or simply overlooked entirely. It is only after dark, and only when the water is disturbed, that the transformation becomes obvious, waves rolling in glowing an unmistakable electric blue, footprints left in the sand lighting up with every step. Sightings have been documented up and down the Australian coastline in recent years. Sydney's northern beaches, including Palm Beach, Manly and Shelley Beach, have all recorded glowing displays, most commonly in spring and autumn, following calm, clear conditions. Jervis Bay has become one of the more reliable locations for photographers hoping to capture the phenomenon, its sheltered waters occasionally lighting up with what witnesses describe as looking like a million scattered stars beneath the surface. St Kilda Beach in Melbourne recorded a striking bloom as recently as 2025, and Victoria's surf coast near Lorne saw its own glowing waves that same June. Tasmania's Storm Bay experienced its largest recorded bloom in almost a decade earlier that year, an event significant enough to draw renewed national media attention to a phenomenon most Australians assumed was little more than an occasional curiosity. That renewed attention is exactly where the genuinely unresolved part of this story begins. Before we go further, my ebook The Timeline Lie covers 15 more sites like this across the country, linked below. Researchers studying these blooms have identified something that goes beyond simply confirming the mechanism behind the glow itself. According to reporting from CNN in September 2025, marine scientists have documented a measurable increase in both the frequency and intensity of bioluminescent blooms along the Australian coastline since the 1990s, a trend researchers have linked to warming ocean temperatures. That link, however, is where the science becomes considerably less settled than a simple cause and effect explanation might suggest. Warmer water alone does not automatically explain why a specific organism's population would grow dense enough at a specific time in a specific location to produce a bloom large enough to light up an entire stretch of coastline. The exact chain of events connecting rising sea temperature to a sudden explosion in Noctiluca scintillans numbers remains an active area of ongoing research, not a fully closed case. That gap matters more than it might first appear. It means scientists can explain with confidence what causes the light itself, a straightforward chemical reaction well understood in laboratory conditions. But they cannot yet reliably explain or predict why these blooms appear to be intensifying over time, why a bloom will strike one beach and skip the next one entirely, or why any specific stretch of coastline might only see the phenomenon once or twice in an entire year, despite seemingly ideal conditions being present far more often than that. If you are finding this as strange as I do, make sure you are subscribed, because there is a genuinely dangerous layer to this story that rarely makes it into the photographs. Despite how magical the glowing water looks in person, marine biologists have been consistently clear that swimming in or touching water occupied by a Noctiluca bloom carries real risk. The organism itself is not considered directly toxic to humans, but dense blooms carry an unusually high ammonia content and can dramatically lower dissolved oxygen levels in the surrounding water, conditions capable of triggering fish kills and broader disruption to local marine ecosystems. Extensive blooms recorded off the coast of India have been directly linked to measurable declines in local fisheries, a reminder that a phenomenon this visually stunning can simultaneously represent a genuine ecological stress signal rather than a purely benign natural spectacle. That contradiction, breathtaking to look at, potentially harmful to the ecosystem producing it, sits at the centre of why researchers are paying closer attention to these blooms now than they have in previous decades. A phenomenon once treated largely as a rare, delightful curiosity for beachgoers lucky enough to catch it, is increasingly being studied as a potential indicator of broader changes happening within Australia's coastal waters, changes still not fully mapped or understood. The unpredictability itself remains one of the most genuinely frustrating aspects for researchers and photographers alike. Even armed with a reasonably solid understanding of the general conditions that favour a bloom, such as calm water, specific temperature ranges, and minimal recent rainfall, scientists still cannot reliably forecast exactly when or where the next major bloom will strike. Chasing sea sparkle in Australia remains, even today, largely a matter of luck. Checking recent reports, watching weather conditions, and being willing to stand on a dark beach on the chance that tonight might be one of the rare nights the water decides to light up. What makes this phenomenon worth taking seriously as more than just a beautiful photo opportunity is the way it sits at the intersection of something ancient and something actively changing. Darwin recorded glowing seas in the 1830s without the scientific tools to understand what he was witnessing. Modern marine biologists now understand the basic chemistry involved in far greater detail, and yet still find themselves genuinely uncertain about why the pattern of these blooms along the Australian coast appears to be shifting in real time, becoming more frequent, more intense, and, according to some researchers, increasingly difficult to separate from the broader story of a warming ocean. Stand on an Australian beach on the right night, in the right conditions, and the water itself will answer part of that question directly. Glowing an impossible electric blue, with every wave that rolls in and every footprint left behind in the wet sand. What it will not tell you, at least not yet, is why this is happening more often than it used to, or where exactly it might choose to happen next. Part of what makes the pattern so difficult to pin down is how differently it behaves from state to state. South Australia has traditionally been considered an unlikely location for bioluminescent displays, and yet occasional bursts have still been recorded around Port Lincoln and Waitpinga Beach near Victor Harbour. Rare enough that even experienced local observers describe them as a genuine surprise each time one occurs. New South Wales, by contrast, has built up a far more consistent record, with Coffs Harbour Marina and Southwest Rocks on the mid-north coast emerging as increasingly reliable bloom locations in recent years, including an unusually intense event recorded in January of 2024. That inconsistency between regions, some coastlines producing blooms with reasonable regularity, while others see them only once in a great while, is itself a piece of the puzzle researchers have not fully solved, since the underlying organism and its general triggering conditions are broadly similar across every documented Australian site. Environmental authorities studying the phenomenon continue to stress a simple but important safety message alongside the science. Anyone hoping to witness a bloom is generally advised to watch from the shoreline rather than entering the water, since conditions along a dark, unfamiliar beach at night carry their own risks entirely separate from the bloom itself. And because a bloom dense enough to glow this vividly is often dense enough to carry the ammonia and oxygen depletion concerns researchers have flagged. That tension between wanting to get close enough to properly experience something this rare and needing to stay cautious around water that may be actively stressed adds one more layer of complexity to a phenomenon that already resists easy explanation. For now, what remains is a genuinely open scientific question layered beneath one of the most photogenic natural events Australia's coastline has to offer. Researchers can explain, with confidence, the chemistry lighting up the water. They cannot yet fully explain why that chemistry is showing up more often, in more places, and with greater intensity than it did a few decades ago, leaving open the possibility that Australia's glowing beaches are not simply a beautiful accident of marine biology, but an early, still poorly understood signal of something larger shifting beneath the surface of the water itself. A small, dedicated community of photographers and amateur naturalists has effectively become an informal, early warning network for these blooms, sharing sightings across social media within hours of a beach lighting up, sometimes drawing crowds to a specific stretch of coastline before the display has even finished for the night. That citizen reporting has, in its own way, started supplementing the formal scientific record, giving researchers a broader, more immediate picture of exactly when and where blooms are occurring than official monitoring alone could easily provide. It is an unusual collaboration. Professional marine biologists working alongside beachgoers with nothing more than a phone camera and a willingness to stand on a dark beach past midnight, all trying to piece together the same fundamentally unanswered question.